Hello, I'm Gregory Seltz. Welcome to our Liberty Alert today on Wednesday. I hope and pray that you're doing well. It's been a long 3 and 4 weeks for a lot of us, kind of cooped up in our homes. I hope that you're doing well physically. And today we'll talk again about the importance of your spiritual health as well as your economic health too, and why those are so vital. Our theme for today, what we're dealing with, especially the questions that we're getting in our office are, should we go back to work? Should we protest not being able to go back to work? Should we still stay hunkered down? What should we do? And what is the church's response to this? And what I want to tell you is we need to frame those questions properly. And so we're talking about getting back to normalcy. And we are going to get back to normalcy. But there's a two-kingdom citizenship, sanctified common sense way of dealing with these things. And that's what we want to talk about today, because I want you to have biblical knowledge as to how to do these kinds of things, because there's a lot of questions that are being asked us. And to give that response, we've got to ask the question, what is God doing to preserve, and what is God doing to save, and how do those things relate? So we're going to get to all of that today. But it is interesting today as we talk about it. I love the government has put out, the commission has put out a document called Saving Lives and Livelihoods. I would ask you to go look at that. It's a very good document. It's a very balanced approach to how to open up these issues. But notice what they said, lives and livelihoods. There's two things right now that are in tension. And they both are vital and both are important. And lives are at stake in both issues. And so, sometimes in a sinful, broken world, we get into a point where there's really not a good answer. There's the lesser of two bad answers. And we'll explain that today, because only kind of the Christian worldview can understand how there can be two bad answers, but one has to be done. The Texas governor kind of put it a little differently. He said there are some things that are worth living for. And he was talking about taking the risk of opening up Texas, because if you don't, we could destroy so much that we could destroy the livelihoods and the futures of many, many, many people. Well, there are some things worth living for. There are some things worth even dying for. There's some things worth risking for. And so the question is, how do you know what those things are? Now, before we get into all this, let me just say this. Science is not going to give you the answer to that question. I'm getting a little bit perturbed even with Christians who say, well, the science will lead us. Folks, science has been politicized incredibly in our culture today too. I'll give you an example. If the science were going to lead us, when I was a pastor, young pastor, I kept saying, man, the STDs that are now out there because of sexual libertinism, eventually people are going to say, wow, this is a terrible way to live. We don't want to do this. We don't want to open ourselves up for this. You would think that the science would have told them, hey, maybe we need to live more chaste, virtuous lives. Well, what's happened since that? Well, the science is overwhelming. These are bad things to do to ourselves. The other one is pro-life. Pro-life is pro-science. From the minute you are conceived, you are a human being. Well, people kind of ignore that today. And they say, well, but you're not the kind of person we think you should be. And so there are people who will even legislate killing a baby after it's born because it was supposed to have been aborted, even up to the day it's born in the 9th month. Why? Because they determined it wasn't a person yet. Well, that's not scientific. Okay, and so science has been politicized too, and so we get to that point where we got to say, wait, there's got to be a moral framework that understands some of these issues. Another way of looking at what science can do: if you drive a car today, your speedometer, which is the scientific measure of what's going on, can tell you how fast you're going. So if you're going 25 miles an hour, the question is that the right speed or not? The speedometer can't tell you that. In a neighborhood, 25 miles an hour, that's the right speed. On the freeway, that's a wrong speed. It's dangerous. In fact, you got to get off the freeway if you're only going 25 miles an hour. 55 miles an hour, 65, 75, is that the right speed, the wrong speed? The science can tell you the speed. There's got to be a moral framework to engage these kind of things. One other thing, before we get into this today too, I've got we've got mom and pop papers that help you understand some of these things. And as we get into these fundamental ways of thinking so we can apply them to the issue, there's more information on our website lcrlfreedom.org. They're called mom and pop papers, and one of my favorite ones is called It's Wrong When the Referee Plays the Game. Those of you who are sports fanatics, you hate watching a game where the ref starts to tell us how to play it, how to shoot, when to shoot, starts calling way too many fouls, etc., etc. You hate, the best ref is the one you never see there, but they kind of manage the game according to the agreed upon rules. But you want the players to play the games. Well, we're starting to see these politicians who are kind of the referees of our culture, they're starting to want to play the game as if it's their game to play. And again, that's I think a helpful way of understanding how we keep all these pieces in their proper place. And by the way, enough with the bomb throwers. Those people who are starting to talk about blood on hands, you should not listen to that. I mean, moving forward, these are tough issues. These are lesser of two evils issues, but something has to be done. And so let's try to do the one thing that, again, or the right thing that honors God, honors neighbor as we move forward. All right, so getting back to normalcy, Two Kingdom Citizenship in action today. Here's some of the questions we've been hearing from you. What should our next response be that honors God and neighbor? That's what we're going to talk about. And of course, we've been talking about that there are principles, even moral principles, 10 Commandment principles that are in tension. Honor God and worship, honor mom and dad, the sanctity of life, you should not murder. All of those things are kind of in tension right now, okay? Obviously, one is penultimate, one is ultimate. But again, there's some guidance that we're struggling with because there are some issues. This is a kind of crisis moment, even though I don't like to use that word crisis. I'm going to talk today about a two-kingdom grid of engagement. And I hope that will be helpful to, should I do this personally? Should the church do this? There's a grid that we use, because if two kingdoms is the way God engages the world, then sometimes I should engage just as a citizen who has a Christian worldview. Sometimes the church needs to say, thus saith the Lord. The church gets in real trouble when it says, thus saith the Lord, when it's really just the Christian citizen's responsibility to do that. I heard a pastor say, God actually doesn't want states to open up right now. If he's speaking as an individual, that's his opinion, that's fine. But I don't think we know either way, because does that mean that God wants 22 million people to be out of work and all the physical and spiritual and emotional ramifications, including death, that comes with that too? That I think was an overstatement of his concern. But he has real concerns. But that's not the church doesn't have a thus saith the Lord on that, even though it has biblical principles that can help guide his particular political viewpoint too. What are the unique challenges and opportunities of the American context? We've got to understand how some of these biblical principles work here, because the American political context is rather unique in the world today. Okay? And we'll talk about why that's a good thing for you. No matter what your politics are, that's actually a good thing for you in how you can live your life faithfully to God. Then what should I do? Or what should we do? Should we stay put? Go about our business for livelihood, worship, family, community? How should we do that? Protest? Not protest? Why? How? Should I protest as a citizen? Should I protest as a churchman? What should I do there? And hopefully at the end of this discussion, by the way, we do Liberty lectures on this, sometimes 3 and 4 hours worth of lectures on this. I'm not going to be able to get to all of that today, but I want to give you at least an understanding of the framework that we try to use when we think through these questions. And then COVID-19, crisis solution. What does a two kingdom sanctified common sense perspective, how does that help us? Okay, before we jump in then to some of these foundational things, I'm just going to say it again. Politics can never save you. Science cannot save you in the sense of give you the kind of things that make it, that allow you to be the human being you were meant to be. They are enhancements, they're gifts of God. Politics is a gift of God. Science is a gift of God. There's all kinds of gifts of God that we have. But again, putting them in the framework that comes from the moral framework that God gives us or from the faith framework that God gives us. Science can't give you those things. Politics can't give you those things. I think our founding fathers ordered things well when they put the state on the bottom and they put the free, religious, disciplined citizen on the top. And that's how they put the church and the state in tension. I think that was a really wise thing to do, and we'll talk about why. And why that matters really now. All right, so how does God engage the world? We got to get this right, Christians. If we're thinking with a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, we've always, when we're talking about public policy, public moral engagement, we're always asking, how does God engage the world for the sake of the world and for the sake of the gospel? And what you're going to find out, which is the radical thing of the Bible, is God engages the world two different ways, okay? So we call it two kingdom, but it's God at work to preserve the sinful world and God at work to save the sinful world. And he does it radically different. And so here's one of the pictures I use. You see this, it looks like a knight, Angel Gabriel, Prince Charles, again, how this is understood in history, but I think this is the Angel Gabriel, but it looks like a knight. And the knight is keeping the forces of evil at bay in the world so that the pastor can go up and proclaim the good news of the gospel that Jesus lived, died, and rose again. This is God's preserving work. This is God's saving work. This one is a whole different kind of work of trying to keep a sinful world from going over the edge. And so in the way we teach it in churches, it's God's curbing use of the law. It doesn't change anybody's hearts, but it says you're not going to go any farther than this. Okay? Honor your father and your mother. That's a foundational thing. The mom and dad and family are foundational to society. If you have someone say that that's not true, which there is a scholar today saying that this is an opportunity, coronavirus is an opportunity to obliterate the nuclear family. That's her writing. That person is dangerous because she's obliterating the curb that allows us to have a civil society, a preserving civil society. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. All those kinds of things. God uses them in their most outward expression to curb evil from becoming even worse than it could be. And even non-Christians have a sense of this. The conscience is written in every human heart. So again, this is what I call God's preserving work. It's radically different. God preserves the world through this outward manifestation of his law for the sake of all people. And then he saves the world by actually living and dying, taking upon himself our own punishment, and he offers that as a gift. It's radically different. And so when you start to differentiate God's work, now you're beginning to see the biblical understanding of how to engage these issues. How do I know this? Again, we do a whole lecture on this, but I'll run through it pretty quickly. Matthew 22, where Jesus is engaged by these people about a tax issue. Give to God what is God's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And then even tell Caesar, your authority is something God gives you, and so you have to honor God in that vocation. As we talk about there, when you start to hear people talk about separation of church and state, we like to use the word differentiation of church and state. This is a Christian worldview. The secular worldview does not know anything about church and state, it just knows state. The theocratic worldview is it knows only church, but the separation and the distinction and differentiation, that's a Christian perspective. So if you believe that, you should thank the Bible, because that's the Bible's framework for the liberties you have in this culture. God is in control. That's Romans 13. So Christians, you're going to have to struggle with God is in control, and he might even be working through a magistrate that you didn't vote for, that you don't always agree with. But he calls you first to honor him, and then actually to hold him accountable to the things that he's supposed to do by the contract that we see called in America. There's a contract called the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, those kinds of things that limit his power in our life. And so we hold him accountable to that. But again, even in Romans 13, Caesar was not a just individual in many, many ways, and yet there was a sense that God's people were called to even honor him. We've been given some constitutional protections I think that the first century people wish they would have had. But let's use them wisely for the sake of our culture and for the sake of the church. Acts 5, Christian disobedience. I hear people all the time, when can we disobey? That's not the Christian way of thinking. Christian obedience is always obedience. We're always trying to be obedient to God and honoring the culture and the magistrates in control. But if we get to a point where we realize that they're not going to let us honor God, then we must be obedient to God there. And then finally, Acts 16, look at this sometime where you see Paul putting his temporal liberty to work. And notice this, he didn't have to do what he did. He claimed his Roman citizenship for a purpose. He could have done otherwise. And both would have been acceptable. But the fact that he did claim it is very helpful. And my question is, what do we have in our citizenship that Paul didn't have that we could exercise for the sake of our culture and for the sake of the church? Paul was technically not a citizen. He was a subject with rights. We're actually citizens, and that's actually a radically different concept in the world today. All right, and so two kingdom cultural engagement. Again, go read on our website this, but you've got to understand these things if you're going to try to do the right thing as we move forward into this very confusing time of what should we do moving forward. We call our engagement dynamic differentiation. That's our mindset. We know God is at work to preserve and save. So the question is this a preserving question or is this a saving question? We have mom and pop papers that say, what would the Father have us do? Because that's a preserving thing, okay? Honor your father and mother. You should not commit adultery. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Those are his, moral foundation posts that preserve a society, even if people are coercively doing the right thing. And so again, right there, we differentiate that from the church's work, where the church is actually offering the grace of God as a gift. There we ask, what would Jesus have us do? And we do it. We would never ask the policeman to turn the other cheek, but in sharing Christ, of course I would turn the other cheek and give the shirt off my back. All those kinds of things need to be differentiated to do what they were called to do. Here's a couple of other things real quickly, and again, if you want us to come talk this through with you, we have a whole weekend where we call them Liberty Lectures, and that's something we get into, and then we can take your questions even more personally. But we think that Reformation restraint, seeking justice. So when you jump in, the first impulse is not to destroy what's there. You may not like what the magistrates are doing. You may not like what the police are doing at that moment. The first impulse for a Christian is not to destroy what they see because they think it's unjust. Because God actually still may be doing some preserving work there that you can build on. Now, we always seek justice. But again, we always understand that God may be doing some work there that I don't fully understand yet. So when I jump in, I have a Reformation restraint to this preserving work to just see what is God doing, because he could be doing something very good through a non-Christian, through a secular person who's honoring the moral structures of life. And maybe I missed that, okay? Here's the other one that we talk about, vocational respect. So the first thing I do is I respect you if you have an honorable vocation, I respect you in that, even if I disagree with how you are exercising that vocation. But I'm still seeking the truth. I always use the restaurant example where, you have some parents, they're the parents of a child, and the child is actually, they have a whole different view of whether they should discipline, not discipline than maybe I do. And you're watching the child, maybe he's 2 years old, and he's taking his food and he's shooting at mommy and daddy. And it's hitting mom and dad, and the mother is saying, or the father is saying, now Jimmy, we talked about this. You're violating our personhood and our space. And the child's going, they're not going to discipline me. This is great. And he starts shooting and having fun. Now, what don't you do? You don't get up and go say, here's how you should parent, sir, or here's how you should parent, ma'am. You just kind of endure that. That's their view of their vocation, and you honor that as much as you're able. Now, if the carrots fly over the table and hit you in the head, maybe you get up and say something at that point. But vocational respect, seeking the truth. And again, this is the kind of stuff as we get involved with, we're getting involved sometimes with politicians or mayors and things that maybe we didn't even vote for. Well, we still have a vocational respect for their authority, but we also seek the truth, and there's truth to what they're supposed to do with that vocation. And of course, we have constitutional rights then to address those if there's violations. Okay? Now, this is the one thing I want to give you, but it's going to go so fast. I'm sorry, but again, you've got to understand this if you're going to talk about, should the church say this or should I say this? And how do we work that out? Robert Benny's got a book called Paradoxical Vision. I think it's an excellent resource. And he says there's 4 ways the church engages the world. And the first 2 boxes, 1 and 2 today, is most of the way we engage the world. Why? Because we believe that the public engagement of the world, political engagement of the world, moral engagement of the world is a penultimate work of God. It's got to be done. You can't even do evangelism if the church is not known as a moral, ethical voice in the community for the sake of the community. But generally speaking, how do we engage? We engage indirectly and unintentionally, which means we go to church, we hear all these things about how God does things, the moral structure of the world that He created, and then we live our lives. The Protestant work ethic might be an example of that. We didn't say that there was such a thing. We just thought we're supposed to work. God says work is good. God says we should take care of our families. God says we should work so that we have something to share. God says that, so we live that way, and it starts to infuse the culture around us. Indirect and intentional. Now we might talk about a specific issue. We might say the sanctity of life, and then say, life is precious, life is valuable because God created it. Well, that's going to compel citizens to say, well, this law doesn't honor that, so I'm going to disagree with that. Now, we didn't tell them how to vote. We didn't tell them how to exercise that truth, but maybe we may have talked about abortion in Bible class, or we may have talked about the rights that we have as individuals because God created us, and so life is precious, life is His, and all of life is a gift. And then people went out and did what they were going to do. We're still, as a church, it's not directly dealing with society's issues. It's talking about them in context, and then people exercise their citizenship faithfully. Generally speaking, this is the best way the church engages these issues. There are times, though, where Benny says that the church has to speak as a corporate voice. And by the way, our LCRL limits that corporate voice to religious liberty, because it's for all people. Sanctity of life, it's for all people. The institution of marriage, because that's a religious liberty issue for us. We have the right to proclaim what God says about the institution of marriage and the right to exercise that. And then the fourth one is educational freedom. We have the right as parents to determine how our children are educated, and those are two religious liberties issues for us. But again, we would say you have that right too, even if you disagree with me. We tend to fight for those four because once you get past those four, it's tough to say, thus saith the Lord, about a lot of these policies that are out there. Or you might have Christians who are sincerely Bible-believing Christians who disagree with a particular policy, and they both might have a point. So again, when we start talking about direct and unintentional, now we're speaking prophetically. We're saying the government's doing something it shouldn't be doing. But again, we don't necessarily have a specific way the church is demanding that the government redress these things, or that we're telling people how they should address this. When John the Baptist speaks about Herod's dalliances, he's speaking prophetically, and he's saying this is going to be held accountable, but he's not saying how. He's not saying what we should do. He's not telling us to storm the castle kind of thing. You can already begin to see this is where things get dangerous, because now the question is the church, is that the main role of the church in the world? And is this penultimate work of government the ultimate thing we got to address? If they violate the sanctity of life, religious liberty, I would say, yeah, that's a huge issue. And we need to stand up for that. But to some of these other degrees, your exercise as citizens is probably the best way to do it. And finally, the direct and intentional, and this is where some of you are starting to ask, the realm of civil disobedience. What am I supposed to do at this point? I'm not going to tell you how to apply this right now, but I'm going to give you some things that you've got to go through to answer those questions, to be faithful to God, who says, honor me, honor my work in this world, and be faithful to me and serving of neighbor, and then move forward in a way that I can understand and I can proclaim and I can stand on for the sake of others. And we'll get to that in a minute. But this grid of engagement helps me, and most of the time we're in 1 and 2. And by the way, you need to be faithful citizens. This is where our church needs to actually say, hey, I took responsibility, and we need to share why we did what we did, even with our friends and neighbors too. But as a church, that direct and intentional, boy, that thus saith the Lord is a big word, because God never said that He was going to save the world through His preserving work. And so that's why I said you don't have many. It's interesting today. I was talking to Yvette about this. Today, people want certainty in the realm of politics, and they want uncertainty in the realm of spirituality. When God says you're not going to have certainty in the realm of politics, you'll have some principles that you should never violate, but you're going to have a lot of lesser of two evil situations, because it's a broken world, and it's never going to be utopian. But you can have certainty in your spiritual life. because God sent his son to live, die, and rise again for you. Isn't it interesting how the world has shaped those questions today? All right, now the uniqueness of the American experiment, and folks, I think we need to understand this because we keep hearing that America's a uniquely bad place today or America's a uniquely good place, but no one understands really why. And so again, individual liberty, that's what makes America unique, because they say there's a higher authority than the state. And that is in question today in some people's minds. Well, if there's no higher authority than the state, then all of the constitutional protections go with it. I've been trying to say that in our lectures. I wish kids understood that when they go there and hear, well, the church is not that big of a deal. No, if the church suddenly becomes nothing but a private institution and the church loses its public voice in our culture, so you will also lose your individual rights as a people. And our founders got that. They said the state was where tyranny comes from, because then the state, the power organization, grabs hold of that power and then conforms your life to it. And you as a citizen will cease to exist because you won't have any power to stand against the state. We do a whole lecture on where that came from in Western culture, why that came about, because it's pretty unique in the world history. Here's a couple of other things. Inherent dignity, because you're created in the image of God. That's a unique thing that our culture, we didn't always live up to that, but our documents wouldn't let us stay there then. It said, you better start living up to it because that's what we know is true. These things don't change, folks. I keep hearing people say, well, we're a progressive people today. We're a different people. No, we're still a people who have inherent dignity because God created us. And if God didn't create us, then inherent dignity goes with it too. Then you have a state determining your dignity by your usefulness to the state. I am hearing people say, well, there is a higher authority than the American government, the United Nations. So there is a higher authority, the World Health Organization. Those are not higher authorities. Those are just other state authorities, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. There's a higher authority to all of this, and that's that there's a moral structure to the world because God created it. And again, our founding fathers put this into our documents, and it's been a precious thing. It's protected all people, not just Christians. Here's what makes America unique. This is it. It says, while we have human dignity, there are other people who say humans have dignity. Of course, they mean the state gives it, but they still say it. The total depravity of man is what the founding fathers also understood. And they understood the brokenness of humanity and the power and the need to prevent power from coalescing in power groups like the government and the police and all those different things. The family structure was the ultimate authority civilly, and those other ones were delegated authorities. And the founding fathers understood why. And then ultimately God was in charge of all this, and we all had to honor God. And so again, that's because there's a depravity in the human heart. And so if we don't protect ourselves from the worst things we can do, it doesn't always mean we're still going to do the best things. That's got to come from a different motivation. But the founding fathers are more concerned about preventing the worst things we can do to each other. And here's the last thing that's really unique. The Caesar model, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, you know, that Jesus differentiates. In Paul's day, Caesar was on top. And Caesar, and you as a subject were on the bottom, even if you had, Roman rights. The Caesar model's been flipped upside down in the American experiment. So in that sense, when you exercise your citizenship, you are exercising your role as a Caesar for the sake of our culture. And you need to take that responsibility very seriously, because it's not just your vote, it's how you act as a citizen, how you act as a mom and dad, how you act. The founding fathers said free individuals, religiously motivated and self-disciplined, that Caesar was the best solution for the big problems of life. So again, the Caesar model's been flipped upside down. So these governors, they don't have the right to, by edict, tell us what to do. Now, we have willfully suspended some of our individual rights because we see a greater good that needs to happen right now, the protection of our neighbor from this COVID virus. But they didn't have the right to suspend our rights. We willfully gave up those rights for a time. And they have to determine the use of that gift, we gave that up, for the small time of this particular crisis. And right now we're starting to hear people say, no, I had the right to actually tell you that and to take those rights away from you. No, you don't have that right. You don't. And so we want to actually start to say, well, what do we do there? So some other foundations, don't forget, God is in control right now. He's the one who preserves. He's the one who saves. And so don't be afraid. Do not be afraid of any of these things. God is in control. And find ways to be neighbor even now to those who don't necessarily even know who the true God is from the Scripture. Especially now, though, in America, there are constitutional protections. And those are for the surviving and thriving of all people. And they don't go away. There's some wisdom in these constitutional protections. One of you had asked, but these are not necessarily biblical, or God says, yes, a Christian can exist in every polity in the world. We can exist under any government. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thankful for the government protections we have, and then we shouldn't try to exercise those things. As I said to you last time, if you start to talk about exercising your rights, talk about how you're exercising them for the sake of your neighbor, not just to protect yourselves. And when you put this is what we want to do in that kind of language, people start to go, wow, I didn't know that's what you guys were doing. So even as we move forward on some of these things, try to make sure you put that language out there so that people realize we're not just a church that's worried about defending its right to have worship. We're talking about why this is an essential thing and why we want even our friends and neighbors who aren't Christian to have it too. And in this emergency moment, it's a preserving moment, but again, let mercy be the thing that guides you. Again, today, our biblical two-kingdom mindset is motivated by God's moral clarity in the Scripture and undeserved mercy, and it's going to help us define our way forward. And I think it's going to help us define our way forward personally and corporately, okay? So personally and corporately, and the Constitutional Bill of Rights, it protects that for us. Okay? That's the key. So if you put it this, we need to understand this biblical mindset. We need to understand this clarity from the Scripture. We need to be motivated for not just for our own protection, but for the sake of our culture, and let that define our way forward. And then the Constitution, the Bill of Rights protects that, and we're thankful for that. And we're not going to let somebody take that away from us or from anybody. So what to do? Personally, again, like I said, the Saving Lives and Livelihoods document, review that. I think it's a very good document, and it tells you how to abide by these reasonable guidelines for you, your family, your church, as we seek normalcy, and we're going to get back to normal. Do not listen to folks who are saying we're not going to get back to normal. Well, they usually mean by that some of these rights are going to have to be curtailed. What? Again, we talk about the science behind what's going on. Dr. Fauci, I appreciate what he's saying about the virus, but let me just say this. Models are not necessarily good science, because models only work by the information we put in there. I used the model the other day about mortgage. You can put, you put the price of the home, you put the percentage, you put the down payment, you put the term, and then you come out, can I afford the house? Well, you can put any number you want in there. The question is, does that number actually adhere to reality? And sometimes these models don't. I appreciate what they're doing with the virus itself and how they're investigating it, how it works, how it doesn't work, and we're still working through that so that we can see what's going on. But when he started to say something about whether or not we should shake hands, ultimately going forward, for now, no. Wear your gloves, yes, I get all that. Make sure you always wash your hands. That's an always thing. But he was talking about changing the whole structure of how we honor one another, greet one another, and yet at the same time he gave advice that said, if you're going to do a hookup, which you call this thing, and a stranger shows up at your door and you may want to have sexual relations with them, well, that's your choice. Well, that's cockamamie thinking right there. So as he extends his scientific perspective to these moral, ethical issues, I think we're the ones who can help guide those discussions. And what he said there to me was absurd. Okay, but that's not to say that his scientific knowledge about the virus, yeah, I'm listening very intently and I'm putting that information to work. Wash your hands, social distancing, a mask. Isn't it interesting now that this mask has become an absolute essential? But at the beginning of this, we were told, don't wear it. It doesn't do anything for you. I think a person got thrown off a bus and got a $1,000 fine, and some people are starting to beat on people because they don't have masks on. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, just 2 months ago, we were told by the scientists that the masks didn't help. I'm wearing a mask. I'm even wearing that bandana that some of you saw. Okay, fine. We can put these things to work because we care about our neighbors and we care about our families. But, it's really interesting. I just got off the phone with a person. I don't want to actually get too much into this because there's still information's coming at me pretty fast. But we're starting to be told how to worship by some of the magistrates. And I understand the police, are told what to do by the governors and things like that. But even to the police out there, you got to start asking questions. Do I have the right to do this? And there was one person who called the police and asked them, if I give communion, is that going to be a violation? He said, absolutely, you cannot do it. What do you mean I can't do it? So even if I practice social distancing, wash my hands, wear a mask, even if I do all those things, I can't do this? And what about going forward? Are they going to tell us how to do some of these things going forward? Or are we going to make those decisions as free people who have the right to exercise faith? This is a big challenge right now, and I'm not going to get into this because this is a bigger question than we can do today. But don't let even worship be pushed into the digital realm. Right now, China is actually monitoring Christian groups through Zoom. There's a sense we're coming together. We were meant to be gathered together. And so we're suspending that right for a time. I understand why. But let's not create whole new ways of doing things that God actually, He called us together. He comes to us in the flesh. He comes to us in a real present way. And we then are formed as a community amidst all this other stuff. Let's not let the magistrates determine moving forward how we're going to do all of that. That's just my note to you. I see people with good thoughts on both sides of this, but there's a fundamental issue there. And when a policeman can tell a pastor, no, you can't. I'll give you another example. There are people who are, in the hospital right now. There are also people who are in nursing homes, and they are they're going through very difficult times. And some of them are very close to actually meeting their Maker. Are you telling me that I cannot go and share the gospel with them? I cannot go and bring the sacrament to them, even if I honor all the same things that the nurse or the doctor has to do? The doctor and the nurse can come and touch because they've got gloves on and masks on. Can I not do that as a pastor to bring the things of Christ? If I'm an essential element of our culture, I should be able to find a way to do this essential work. And they will not determine what is essential of my work as a pastor or a Christian. So again, that's where this stuff's going. And there are some people who are saying that what they really mean to say is you're not essential. And I've got a document in my hand that says the church is an essential element of society, and pastoral and ministry is an essential element of society. Seeking normalcy personally or corporately, lives are at stake. But the crisis we're facing today is physical, social, economic, and spiritual. And science can't answer all those questions, and government surely was never supposed to answer all those questions. Okay, so again, this is where the church needs to be part of the solution. We need to be part of that. So care today is more than physical health alone. So how are we going to look after one another as we go forward, even if there are still threats of these things? And what if the threat is 22 million people out of work and people dying because of anxiety or dying because they can't fend for themselves anymore? The government cannot take over your role as a provider for your own family. I found it interesting. I said, look to the family, the church, and the community, especially now. I found it interesting to hear this Harvard professor who says that right now we should obliterate the family. That now's the time, in the middle of the corona crisis. When in reality, I thought about the fact that going to my family, to my extended family, and to talk about what if this all came unraveled, how would we get together? How would we support one another? It was a great, it was a great comfort to think about all of us thinking about each other at that moment. This person wants to wipe all that out so that we look to the state for everything we need. That's just crazy to me. And we should actually push back and talk about why the family is so important right now, why the church is so important right now, and for the sake of our community. Okay? So what to do? We're going to seek normalcy now because we know lives are at stake in all of these versions of the crisis. And now the question is, again, what's the right answer? I think right now we're at a moment of what's the lesser of two wrong answers. And only if you understand the depravity of man and the brokenness of man and the fact that God is willing to preserve that world so that He can bring His saving message into it, only then can you understand that sometimes you're going to get into situations where you get two not good answers, but you have to do something. So if we close everything down and keep closing everything down, we're going to create a huge crisis that's going to destroy lots of lives over here. If we open up, we're going to still have the threat of this. Now the question is, which threat is the growing threat that's worse? And that's where we're at in a lot of these issues. All right. Now, this is the one thing that people have said, but what about protesting? Again, the tension of how best to serve neighbor and how best to be faithful of God still exists. And so, protest, not protest. There's not going to be a perfect solution going forward, as I just talked about. And there may be a better solution, but there's never going to be an ultimate best solution for all of these things. And like I said, we've been talking about that lesser of two evils things. And that comes if you understand the foundational truths that man has inherent dignity, but there's also inherent depravity. Or not inherent depravity, but there's depravity in man because of the fact that man brought sin into God's world. So if those two things are held, if we understand those things, we understand we're probably in a situation like this. And so now we're asking, which one has the least damaging ramifications going forward? And I still think we have to say, Lord, please forgive us for the fact that we've messed this world up so much that sometimes your world comes down to two lesser of two evils issues. Give us wisdom, humanity to move forward either way, by your grace and by your mercy. Now, this is a real threat right now. And so now we're at this point where we can ask the question, what about the growing government overreach? As I said before, I just got off the phone where, there's a governor who's literally locking down, and there's mayors locking down these things way more than the government guidelines. And they're starting to usurp their role in doing their job. And that is a bad thing. And so the question first is, well, should I still wait that out? Should I suffer that injustice? The first thing as a Christian is not every injustice is something we must act upon immediately with pushing back. Remember, reformation, restraint, seeking justice. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't act either. So what if you can't wait it out? Now, I have some people are saying, look, I'm already out of money and I can't pay my bills. And by the way, I've tried to see if I could apply to one of those PPP loans, and they ran out of money before. They gave me 2 days to do it because the 501c3s were put at the back of the line. And by the time I got the information I needed, they had already shut down and said there's no more money. Well, if that money was absolutely essential for this month of operation, thank God some of you have been gracious to us and been sharing some of your resources with us even now. We couldn't have made it. And there's a lot of businesses right now that are in that mode. How am I going to tell them that they don't have the right to protest, being told that they cannot provide for themselves? So again, that's something as you work it out in your own life and your own livelihood, and then use some of these guidelines that have been given to us, because I think they're very, very helpful. Essential freedoms have essential protections, and that's what I said when I was looking at this this document from the federal government. They basically are challenging us to have our own plan, to have a plan. If we are an essential group, what is our plan of opening up to others? And let us put those things together before we decide how we're going to act. Have that plan ready to go. Also, it says when it talks about homeschooling, they're trying to make sure that people have access to the resources that they had because their taxes were taken out for that purpose. We've always said parental choice would put the parents in charge of that money. Well, some of these people are homeschooling, and they need to have resources to connect to ways of educating their kids going forward because of this crisis. Well, that's I think a helpful way of talking about this, to talk about how the parents have that responsibility and that role. So use your rights moving forward. And then the other one is talking about how the church and worship are essential, and talking about how the church is supposed to be a part of this. And so again, if you're a churchman trying to figure out what to do, I think the first thing you should do is think through this thing like we've talked about. Talk about it with your people. Come up with a plan of action you think is right and just. Talk to your circuit. Talk to your district president. Make sure that you're honoring those who have responsibility over you. And then, as this one pastor did, call the police and say, this is what we want to do. We're trying to honor the guidelines. We're trying to do what's right. But we're an essential ministry, and there's people who really need our services right now. We need to do that. How can we do that and still make sure that we're honoring you? And I've seen people do that. Well, if you get the answer, you can't do it, then you have a problem. Now, the good news is the Department of Justice is on your side. Right now, they've already issued a kind of a communique that says you can't treat people this way. The Trinity Lutheran case, what's amazing, they're using the Trinity Lutheran case as their foundation. You cannot treat churches different than other organizations. So if you're allowing this to happen, and there was a church that was having people come, they were in their cars, they were doing all these different things, and that church, every one of those people were fined. I think it was $500, I think. And yet they were letting drive-in restaurants operate with the windows down, people bringing food to people's cars, all that kind of stuff. So the DOJ said, you can't do that. And then the next thing is, you are an essential worker. And if an essential worker is a healthcare worker, then a pastor, a Christian at work for the sake of that community, that worshiping community, you're an essential worker, not just to your community, but to the community at large. How can you move out as an essential worker? You should have a plan for that, and then try to exercise that plan by getting all the, honoring all the authorities that you can before you implement that plan. That'll give you an opportunity to stand your ground if it comes to that. So in closing today, just some of these guidelines, I hope that they help you address some of these issues. I wanted you to see how we as a two kingdom people address these things. We know God's at work, but his preserving work is penultimate. It serves his ultimate work of saving. So we don't ever want to confuse those things. But we have responsibility in his penultimate preserving work too. So here's a question from Chris. He says, at this point, is it the church's duty to prophetically tell the left-handed kingdom that they're violating the very law they swore to uphold, especially as it relates to the exercise of religion? And then in that vein, when is it the responsibility to civilly disobey unlawful orders? Good question. I think we've already talked about that a little bit. But again, here's where I would say, make sure you put together your guidelines, how you understand how you are to move forward as a church. Get the wisdom not only of your elders, your people, as much as you're able, but also your religious, those who have an authority or a responsibility too. So your circuit counselor, your district president, so they understand how you're thinking this through. They understand what you're trying to do, and then use the guidelines that the government has given so that you can kind of formulate your practices in view of those guidelines. And then I would even call the magistrates. I'd call your mayor, I'd call their office, I'd call the police chief and say, this is what we're trying to do as an essential element of our society. We're not a non-essential. And so if this is what the nurses, the doctors have to do their essential work, we will honor those same things as we do our essential work. But again, go through that process and see where that gets you, so that when you finally do it, you're doing it, being very transparent of what you're trying to accomplish. Some of the issues that I do think our faith speaks to, I don't like what's happening with this snitching on each other. This is a terrible model. This is usually how tyranny starts. When you think of Nazi Germany and everyone says that's the ultimate evil in the world, there's lots of evils like that too, by the way. They started having children tell on their parents, that kind of thing. This is not the way free people live. We live in service to one another. We go address issues. If we got a problem, we address it to our neighbors first. We don't go running to the police first or running to the mayor first. So when one of the mayors, and there's been a couple, say, take a picture and send it to us, that's the wrong spirit going forward. I also didn't like, when you start to see one of the governors who said, God did not do that. I don't understand why they have to make this that kind of issue. When he said, God did not flatten the curve, we did. And I thought, wow, what an arrogant statement. Because God actually flattened the curve in other places. California is not reacting the same way that New York is. Why? Because there's herd immunity that's going on there, because they were susceptible to that virus long before anybody else and didn't even know it. And so the bodies God created, the antibodies that God created already were doing their job. And all the mayor was doing is giving God's gift of the antibodies of our own body more time to work. And even the things, the solutions we're looking for are part of God's gift to the world that we're now creating and putting together. But that wisdom's been there. We just hadn't discovered it yet. And so to stand up at this point and say, we did it, when you're not even honoring the fact that God's actually healing people all over the place, just by the created bodies that you have. So that kind of stuff, we need to say, wait a minute, why do you have to put it in that kind of language? Because that makes it now a discussion about, is God essential to this debate? Actually, God is in charge of this debate, and we need to be faithful to that. The destroy the family kind of stuff, we've got to be careful about that as well, because who would ever want to use this time, this opportunity, to destroy one of God's blessings that even if you're not a Christian, being a good family provides civility and stability in the neighborhood. It's what a terrible thing to talk through at this point. So those are some of the questions you had. Those are some of the things that you talked about. I hope that we gave you an understanding of how to deal with these things. Dynamic differentiation, reformation restraint, seeking justice, vocational respect, seeking the truth. That's one of the ways to keep some of these tensions properly in place as you move forward in this. And understand God is in control of this. He's here even now preserving and saving. So let's try to be the two kingdom citizens that honor His work for the sake of our communities and for the sake of His church. God go with you. Let me just get to our morning prayer. If you want to bow your heads with me, because right now prayer is the one great thing we can all do together, knowing that God is at work even now. I thank you, my Heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have kept me this night from all harm and danger. And I pray that you'd keep me this day also from sin and every evil, that all my doings, all our doings in life may please you. For into your hands we commend ourselves, our bodies and souls and all things. Let your holy angel be with us, that the evil foe may have no power over us. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week. And if it's COVID-19 still, we'll be talking about it. Take care.